Imagine being the target of a brutal police stop and having all your rights ignored without any apparent reason. Now, imagine that you are an FBI agent, and those responsible for this stop don't even know who you really are. This is the story of Samuel Reed, a black FBI agent who moved to a small town hoping to start a new chapter in his life, only to be met with distrust and prejudice from local authorities who thought they were above the law. But what these officers didn't expect was that Samuel was not alone, and that his fight for justice would set off a series of events that would shake the power structures in the town of Oak Ridge. Follow this thrilling journey of courage, resilience, and the pursuit of justice as Samuel faces a corrupt system and shows that no one is above the law. Stay with us until the end, like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on what you would do in a situation like this. A cold and silent night embraced the town of Oak Ridge as a dark car drove through the narrow streets. The faint light from the street lamps barely illuminated the path, leaving the corners in deep shadows. Inside the vehicle, Samuel Reed, an FBI agent, had just moved to this new town, seeking a quiet beginning after years of demanding and tense missions in major urban centers. He had always believed that Oak Ridge would be a place to reconnect with himself, far from the constant turmoil he faced at the agency. Samuel was a tall man, with dark skin and a firm posture, his eyes exuding serenity and authority. He was 42 years old, with a brilliant career built through effort and dedication, overcoming countless challenges along the way. He knew well the strength he carried and the respect his badge commanded, but that night would challenge him in ways he had never imagined. Oak Ridge, a small and traditional town, seemed to be asleep, yet the ghosts of prejudice still lingered in the air. Samuel drove slowly, observing the old houses, the shops with simple storefronts, and the small groups of people passing by on the sidewalk. He thought about what his new routine would be like, wondering if he could finally find peace in a place like this. His mind wandered between memories of past missions and the promise of calmer days, until suddenly, a flash of blue and red lit up his rearview mirrors. A police car was right behind, with its sirens on and flashing intensely. Samuel frowned, confused, but didn't hesitate to pull over to the side of the road. The stop was unusual, but he had been pulled over before, even without any apparent reason. He knew what to do: stay calm, explain his position, and resolve everything peacefully. However, as soon as he turned off the engine, he felt a pang of unease. The night, which had previously seemed calm, now had a palpable tension in the air. As he watched through the mirror, he saw two officers getting out of their vehicle with quick, rigid movements. The men, both white and with aggressive postures, walked towards him with their hands resting on the holsters of their guns. Their stern faces and fixed eyes on Samuel indicated they were not there for a friendly conversation. He took a deep breath, adjusted himself in his seat, and waited for the officers to approach. "Good evening, sir. Is there a problem?" Samuel asked, keeping his voice calm and controlled. The officers exchanged a brief look, as if they had already decided something between themselves. One of them, the taller one, with shaved blonde hair and a hard expression, stepped closer to the window. "License and registration, now," he ordered, without a trace of courtesy. His voice was sharp, laden with authority and something else that Samuel couldn't fully identify, but that resembled disdain. Samuel slowly opened the glove compartment, retrieving his wallet and FBI badge. He knew that this should clear up any doubt and clarify the situation, but when he extended the documents, he noticed that the officer didn't even glance directly at the badge. "Here they are, sir. I'm Samuel Reed, an FBI agent. I just moved to town, and I'm on my way home. If there's a problem, we can resolve it now." Samuel kept his voice firm, hoping that mentioning the federal agency would make the officer realize his mistake. But the effect was the opposite. The second officer, shorter and stockier, approached and took the wallet from Samuel's hand brusquely, examining it without showing any sign of respect. "FBI, huh? And what's an FBI agent doing around here, driving a car like this?" he asked with a mocking smile, clearly doubting Samuel. The disdain in his voice was evident. Before Samuel could respond, the stocky officer tossed the wallet onto the ground without even checking the badge. The tension rose instantly, and Samuel realized the situation was taking a dangerous turn. He leaned down to try to reach his documents, but was immediately interrupted by a shout. "Hands where I can see them," the blonde officer yelled, drawing his gun and pointing it directly at Samuel. His eyes were fixed, as if he was waiting for any movement to justify what seemed to be an imminent assault. Samuel raised his hands slowly, trying to remain calm, but he could feel the growing danger. He knew that any wrong move could be fatal. In all his years of service, dealing with criminals, dangerous negotiations, and delicate investigations, he had never felt such immediate and visceral fear. Not because he feared the armed men in front of him, but because of what they represented. A kind of authority corrupted by prejudice and ignorance, something against which he had no defense at that moment. "I don't want to cause any trouble. As I said, I'm a federal agent. You can verify my identity, call the central office, confirm everything. There's no need for weapons." Samuel spoke clearly, keeping his gaze fixed on the officers, trying to de-escalate the situation. But the night seemed destined to spiral out of control. The stocky officer stepped closer, with a cold smile, and slapped the car hood forcefully, like a predator enjoying cornering its prey. "You know, Agent, you might be who you say you are, but around here, you're just another guy in the middle of the night, in the wrong place at the wrong time." His tone was provocative, almost a warning that no matter who Samuel really was, prejudice had blinded these men to any attempt at a peaceful resolution. Out of the corner of his eye, Samuel saw the other officer approaching the car, tapping his flashlight against the windows, as if searching for something to justify a more drastic action. He felt frustration rising, mixed with fear and indignation. How could he, an agent who had dedicated his life to upholding the law, be treated like a criminal just because of the color of his skin and where he was? The small town, which initially seemed peaceful, now revealed a dark side that Samuel had never imagined finding. And deep down, he knew that this night was just the beginning of something much bigger. He needed to find a way to get out of there without escalating the situation, but the officers didn't seem willing to back down. Before we continue with this moving story, remember to like and subscribe to the channel. This is your way of contributing so that we can continue bringing powerful stories about justice and overcoming. Click the subscribe button now and activate the bell so you don't miss the next ones. Shall we continue? The tension in the air was heavy, almost palpable. Samuel kept his hands raised, trying to contain the mix of fear and frustration bubbling inside him. He knew he needed to remain calm, but the situation seemed to worsen with each passing second. The look on the officers' faces wasn't just one of authority. There was something more, a kind of challenge, as if they were determined to exert control over him at any cost. The stocky officer stepped forward, closing the distance between them. He had a cynical smile, the kind of smile that made it clear this was a power game, and he felt he was in control. He leaned slightly, bringing his face closer to Samuel's, and said, "So, Mr. FBI agent, why don't you slowly step out of the car and put your hands on the hood? Huh? Let's settle this quickly." His voice was taunting, dripping with sarcasm. Samuel hesitated for a moment, and the blonde officer quickly took that as resistance. He raised his gun, pointing it directly at Samuel's face, while shouting, "I said get out of the car now." The officer's loud voice echoed down the silent street, and Samuel felt his heart race. He knew there was no other option but to comply, so he slowly unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. Every move he made was closely watched by the officer's eyes, as if they were waiting for him to do something that would justify even more aggressive action. He stepped out of the car with his hands raised, maintaining a calm and controlled posture. As soon as Samuel positioned himself beside the car, the stocky officer approached and pushed his hands onto the hood, forcing him to lean forward. Samuel could feel the cold metal under his palms, a stark contrast to the heat burning inside his chest. He tried to explain once more, his voice firm but controlled. "Listen, there's no need for violence. You can verify my identity and make a call to confirm it. I'm cooperating, but I need you to..." Before he could finish the sentence, he felt a hard blow to his legs, causing him to lose balance and almost drop to his knees. The stocky officer, who had struck him, chuckled and stepped even closer, keeping Samuel pinned against the car. "We're not interested in what you think, Agent. The only thing we want is for you to shut up and do as you're told." got it?" he said, with a tone that mixed disdain and threat. The repeated use of the word agent sounded like mockery, an attempt to discredit and humiliate Samuel. Samuel clenched his teeth, trying to hold back the anger rising within him. He knew that reacting would only make things worse, so he took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. But the officers were not willing to give any chance for dialogue. The blonde officer, who still had his gun out, stepped forward and began rifling through Samuel's car, opening the glove compartment and tossing his belongings onto the ground. "What are you looking for in there?" Samuel asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the pain and humiliation he felt. "There's nothing illegal in my car. You don't have the right to do this." The stocky officer laughed, and the laugh sounded colder than the night wind. He looked at Samuel and said, "Rights? Oh, I don't think you understand how things work around here." He glanced at his colleague, and they both laughed, as if it were a private joke. Samuel couldn't believe what was happening. He had dealt with dangerous criminals, members of organizations that challenged the law, and always maintained his composure. But now, standing on a dark street in Oak Ridge, he found himself powerless against two officers who should be upholding the law, not abusing it. And what made it all the more unbearable was the clear realization that they were doing this because of the color of his skin. They weren't interested in justice. They were interested in exercising their power. The blonde officer finally found Samuel's wallet, opened it, and looked at the badge, waving it in front of Samuel with a sarcastic smile on his face. "So, you really are from the FBI, huh?" he said before tossing the wallet onto the ground again, as if it were a piece of trash. "And you think that means anything to us?" Samuel felt the bitter taste of helplessness, the humiliation of having his authority ignored, of being treated like a criminal, of seeing his badge thrown to the ground as if it had no value, was almost unbearable. But he refused to give up. With his eyes fixed on the officers, he said calmly, "Yes, it does. It means that you're making a very big mistake." The stocky officer's smile faded, and he leaned in closer, almost growling as he responded. "The only mistake here was you thinking you could show up around here and act like you run things." He shoved Samuel hard, causing him to stumble backward. "You're nobody here, got it?" At that moment, the blonde officer did something unexpected. He began using his flashlight to smash the headlights of Samuel's car, each blow an act of pure destruction and contempt. The sound of breaking glass echoed down the empty street, and Samuel watched in shock as his car was vandalized right in front of him by those who were supposed to be defenders of the law. He knew he was being attacked not just physically, but in his dignity, in his identity. Each strike of the flashlight was a blow to the respect he had built over years of service. When the headlights were destroyed, the officer tossed the flashlight aside and turned to Samuel, wearing a sinister smile. "Well, I guess now you're a little more on our level, huh?" he said, as the two officers laughed, satisfied with the destruction they had caused. Samuel, still with his hands raised, tried to maintain his posture, but the anger and pain were evident in his eyes. He knew this situation was far from over, and that he needed to find a way to get out of there without making things worse. But at that moment, he also realized that Oak Ridge would not be the peaceful refuge he had imagined. The town hid a deep poison, and that night, he had tasted its bitter first sip. Samuel stood still, trying to process the intensity of the events. His breathing was heavy, and he could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, drowning out the distant sounds of traffic and leaves rustling in the wind. He was used to handling extreme situations and staying calm under pressure, but nothing in his career had prepared him for this sense of helplessness in the face of the abuse of authority by those officers. While the two men laughed, satisfied with the destruction they had caused, Samuel slowly lowered his hands, trying not to appear as a threat. He needed to make a decision. Should he keep trying to argue and explain his position, or should he accept what was happening, knowing that any inappropriate response could escalate the situation? Each second felt like an eternity as he weighed his options. "I've already told you who I am and showed my ID. You know what you're doing is illegal." Samuel's voice was low, but carried a tone of authority that he hoped would be enough to bring some rationality to the officers. "The only thing I want is to get out of here and resolve this peacefully. You still can?" "Shut up," shouted the stocky officer, interrupting Samuel and stepping toward him. His eyes were filled with a mix of anger and disdain, as if every word Samuel spoke was a personal affront. "You think you can go around giving orders just because you have a badge?" The other officer approached, now without the smile. He stared at Samuel, as if he was assessing what to do next. There was something in his eyes, a mix of doubt and irritation. Maybe a part of him knew they had gone too far, but his pride prevented him from backing down. Instead of responding, he turned, walking back to Samuel's car and started opening the trunk, looking for anything that could justify the brutal stop. Samuel took a deep breath, feeling that he needed to act before the situation completely spiraled out of control. He didn't want to resort to the use of force or do anything that could be interpreted as resistance, but he also couldn't let them continue to abuse their position without any consequence. He knew that, as an FBI agent, he had resources to deal with the situation, but the simple fact of being there, powerless and treated like a criminal, filled him with frustration. "Listen, if you want to resolve this, we can go to the local station and clear everything up there. I'm willing to cooperate, but what you're doing is abuse of power, and you know that." Samuel tried to keep his voice controlled, but the firmness in his words was clear. He was trying to appeal to some sense of reason, to something that might make the officers rethink their actions. The stocky officer shook his head and laughed, approaching Samuel again. He seemed to enjoy the feeling of power he had over the agent, and every word that came out of Samuel's mouth only seemed to irritate him more. "You still don't get it, do you?" he said, pressing a finger against Samuel's chest hard, pushing him back. "Around here, we're the ones in charge. And you're nobody." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. It wasn't just the humiliation of being treated this way, but the clear message that these men saw no value in his position, in his dignity, or even in the law they themselves were supposed to respect. For a moment, he felt tempted to react, to use his authority to assert himself, but he knew that would only escalate the situation and could put his life at risk. At that moment, another car slowly passed by the street, and Samuel noticed there were witnesses to what was happening. Two people in the car glanced at the scene as they drove by, and he could see the shock on their faces. However, the car did not stop, and Samuel felt a mix of despair and hope. Maybe someone would call the police, or even the press, and the situation would take a turn. But for now, he was alone, facing two men who had total control over what was happening there. "You can get in serious trouble for this." "I'm serious," Samuel said, trying once more to find some point of contact. "What you're doing is a crime. I can report this and—" But before he could finish the sentence, the blonde officer, who was closer to the trunk, lifted the flashlight and struck him in the face with force. Samuel was thrown back, falling to the ground from the impact. He tasted the metallic taste of blood in his mouth and felt a sharp pain shoot through his jaw. For a moment, everything was blurry, and he tried to keep his focus, blinking to clear the sensation of dizziness. The stocky officer crouched down next to him, grabbing him by the collar and pulling him up, forcing Samuel to look directly into his eyes. "Seems like you don't learn, do you?" he said in a threatening tone, his face too close, his breath hot and heavy against Samuel's face. "You thought just because we're here, no one would see? No one would care? You think this is going to matter to anyone?" Samuel felt anger building inside him, an anger that came not just from the physical pain, but from the disrespect, from the feeling that, to these men, his life and dignity had no value. But he knew he needed to contain that anger, to channel it in another way. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, even though every fiber of his being wanted to react. As he tried to get up, leaning against the car, Samuel looked directly at the two officers and said, "You might not realize it now, but you're making a mistake that's going to cost you a lot. I won't forget what happened here, and I won't let this slide." The officers exchanged a glance, and for a brief moment, Samuel saw a flicker of uncertainty on the blonde officer's face. But the stocky one quickly regained his posture and smiled, as if amused by the threat. "Of course you won't, Agent." He laughed and took a step back, letting Samuel get back on his feet. "But around here, you're not the one who makes the rules. Maybe somewhere out there, your badge means something. But here, it means nothing." Samuel stood up, still feeling the throbbing pain in his face. He knew he couldn't do anything else at that moment without putting himself at risk. The stop was clearly not about something he had done, but about who he was, and that was a battle he couldn't win there, under those conditions. But he had a plan. He knew that when this night ended, he would have the means to ensure that the two men would be held accountable for their actions. He just needed to get out of there and reach a safe place. Carefully, he stepped back, still keeping his eyes on the two officers, as if he was memorizing their faces. They seemed satisfied, as if they had achieved what they wanted, to impose fear, to exercise power, and to walk away unscathed. But Samuel knew this night wasn't over yet. There would be a moment for him to stand up, to seek justice, and he wouldn't rest until that happened. The next morning, the town of Oak Ridge woke up to another routine day, but for Samuel, the previous night still echoed like a nightmare. He got up slowly, feeling his body aching and his jaw throbbing. The bathroom mirror reflected a face marked by violence, a dark bruise on the left side of his face and a cut on his lower lip. The sight of his own image brought him back to the moment when he was lying on the ground, at the mercy of two police officers who had decided he didn't deserve respect. As he washed his face, Samuel replayed the events in his mind. The anger still burned inside him, but he needed to be pragmatic. This wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger, and he knew his next step had to be careful, methodical. There was a protocol for dealing with abuse of authority and police violence, and he was well aware of the procedures. But Samuel also knew that Oak Ridge was a small town, with a network of influences that could make his job difficult. Determined, he put on a dark suit and adjusted his tie, covering the marks from the night before as best he could. It was a reminder to himself that, despite what had happened, he was still an FBI agent, and he wouldn't allow those officers to erase who he was. He grabbed his briefcase and left the apartment, heading to the temporary office he had set up in town. He needed to prepare the official report on the incident and think about how he would proceed to ensure that justice would be served. When he arrived at the discreet building that served as a small FBI base in Oak Ridge, Samuel was greeted by a colleague, Kevin Sanders, an agent who worked in the same division and had been temporarily transferred to assist him with local investigations. Kevin was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a sharp, observant look. He immediately noticed something was wrong. "Samuel, what happened?" Kevin asked, frowning as he saw the marks on his colleague's face. "Did you get into a fight?" Samuel hesitated for a moment, considering how to approach the subject. He knew that reporting the incident to someone within the agency was necessary, but it was also a risk. Kevin was trustworthy, but still, Samuel needed to be sure that nothing would compromise the investigation he intended to initiate against the officers. "I was stopped last night by two local police officers. The approach was violent and completely unnecessary," Samuel said, choosing his words carefully. "They ignored my identification, assaulted me, and vandalized my car. Clearly, there was an abuse of authority and possibly racial motivation." Kevin listened in silence, absorbing every word. He knew that Samuel was a meticulous agent who wouldn't exaggerate a situation like that. But he also understood that this could turn into a complication for the agency. "Samuel, are you sure you want to go forward with this?" Kevin asked, his voice low and cautious. "We're in a small town. If there's systemic involvement, this could get ugly. The police chief here has political connections. I'm not saying you should ignore it, but we need to think about the ramifications." Samuel nodded slowly. He knew Kevin was right. Any action against the officers could quickly turn into a political issue with repercussions beyond the town. But that was the reason he couldn't let it go. He had faced prejudice throughout his life, but what happened the previous night was not just an isolated case. It was a symptom of something much bigger and more deeply rooted. "I know there are risks, Kevin," Samuel responded, firmly, "but we can't keep ignoring things like this. They abused their authority because they believed they could do it without consequences, because I'm black and they didn't think anyone would care. But they're wrong. Someone will care, and I'm going to make sure of it." Kevin nodded, recognizing Samuel's determination. He knew that trying to convince his colleague to back down was useless. Instead, he changed his approach. "All right, if that's the case, let's do this right," he said, with a slight smile. "We need to document everything and follow procedures. Full report, evidence, and maybe you should get a medical examination to record the injuries. That way, we'll have a solid foundation." Samuel agreed. He knew he would need all of that to face what was coming. The next step would be to collect security camera footage from the streets where everything happened. There might be some video showing the officer's approach, and that would be crucial evidence for his complaint. But he also knew he needed to deal with another important issue: the impact this situation would have on his relationship with the local community. As he left the office, Samuel walked over to the parking lot where his car was still parked, with the headlights broken and obvious signs of vandalism. He looked at the vehicle and felt a new wave of frustration. All this because two men decided he didn't deserve respect. He called a nearby repair shop, explaining the situation and scheduling a time to fix the damage. He needed a functional car to continue his work in the town. While he waited, a man approached him in the parking lot. It was a neighbor whom Samuel recognized from brief encounters at the building entrance, an elderly gentleman with a kind expression, wearing a worn-out cap and carrying a grocery bag. "Good morning, young man. Sorry to bother you, but I heard about what happened last night," said the man, his voice low and concerned. "I heard you had trouble with the police." I'm sorry about that." Samuel looked at the old man in surprise. He didn't expect the news to have spread so quickly, but maybe the curious glances from the night before had done their work. He didn't want the situation to become a rumor or be misinterpreted, but he also felt a small sense of relief realizing he wasn't entirely alone in this fight. "Thank you," Samuel replied, trying to keep his voice calm. "Yes, there was an incident. I'm handling it, but I appreciate the concern." The man nodded, his eyes sad and full of understanding. "I know things can be tough around here. I've seen it before." He hesitated before continuing, as if pondering whether he should speak. "I have grandkids who go through similar things, and it's never easy. If you need anything, just say the word." Samuel smiled at the old man, feeling an unexpected wave of gratitude. Small gestures like that, a simple offer of support, meant much more than he could express. For a moment, he remembered why he had chosen this profession: to protect people who often had no one to defend them. As he walked away, Samuel thought about how the incident from the previous night was already impacting his life in Oak Ridge. He had hoped for a smooth transition, but now he saw that he would have to deal with challenges far beyond his work as an agent. He would need to find allies in the community, people who could support his cause and maybe, in the future, help him reveal the true nature of the officers who attacked him. And somehow, he needed to balance all of this with his duties at the agency. Samuel spent the next few days gathering all the information and evidence he could about the incident. He made a detailed report, including the description of the attack, the verbal threats, and the destruction of his car. He also visited a clinic to undergo a medical examination, documenting the bruises on his face and the cut on his lip. Every step was meticulous, because he knew that to confront those officers and the system that supported them, he would need solid and irrefutable proof. During this time, Samuel noticed something strange. There was a constant feeling of being watched. On more than one occasion, he saw patrol cars slowly driving past his apartment and the temporary FBI office. He knew it could be a coincidence, but it could also be a subtle message, a warning for him to think twice before proceeding. If that was the case, it only made him more determined to continue. That afternoon, Samuel received an unexpected phone call from Kevin. The tone of his voice was tense, as if he was preparing to deliver bad news. "Samuel, we need to talk. Now." Samuel went to the office and found Kevin at his desk, surrounded by papers. He noticed the worried expression on his colleague's face and knew something serious had happened. "What is it?" Samuel asked, sitting down and trying to stay calm. Kevin took a deep breath before starting to explain. "I asked to check the security cameras from the area where you were stopped that night. I managed to get access to some footage, but some of the images seem to have been erased. It's like they were tampered with, and no one here seems to know how or why this happened." The news hit Samuel like a punch to the gut. He had counted on that footage to corroborate his account, to clearly and undeniably show the abuse of power he had suffered. But now, someone was trying to cover it all up. This only confirmed that the problem was bigger than he thought. It wasn't just about two prejudiced police officers, but a system willing to protect its mistakes at any cost. "So that's how they want to play it, huh?" Samuel said, his voice lower than usual, but loaded with restrained anger. They're trying to erase the evidence, thinking it will make me back down. Kevin looked at him, concerned. Samuel, I understand your frustration, but this could complicate things for us. If there's evidence tampering, it means there are more powerful people involved. We might be dealing with a support network that goes beyond the 2 officers who attacked you. Samuel knew Kevin was right, but backing down was not an option. He had spent his life fighting against injustices, and he wasn't going to give up now, especially when the attempt to cover up the case was so blatant. He was silent for a moment, reflecting on the best way to move forward. We need to take this to the next level. Samuel finally said, if the footage was tampered with, that's even more serious. It means they're trying to obstruct a legitimate investigation, and we need external intervention. Kevin nodded, still looking hesitant. I agree, but we need to be careful. If you involve the FBI in an investigation against the local police, we need to make sure we have the necessary support. This could escalate very quickly, and the last thing we want is to turn this into a political war that could distract from the real issue. The abuse you suffered. Samuel knew Kevin was speaking from the experience of someone who had seen situations like this become complicated. But he also knew he had no choice. If he allowed the officers to get away with it, he would be sending a message that abuse was acceptable, and he couldn't do that. I'll send a communication to headquarters and explain the situation, Samuel said, firmly. I want the investigation to be official, and I want someone from outside to review everything. We can't allow this to be swept under the rug. Before Kevin could respond, Samuel's phone rang. He answered, and on the other end, a deep male voice spoke in a direct and intimidating manner. Samuel Reed? The voice asked. Yes, who is this? Samuel replied, trying to identify the voice, which didn't sound familiar. It doesn't matter who I am. Listen carefully. Let this go. You don't know what you're getting yourself into. Things can get a lot worse for you if you keep pushing this. Samuel felt a chill run through him for a moment, but he quickly composed himself. The threat was clear, but it was also a sign that he was on the right track, rattling the right people. Are you threatening me? Samuel asked, his tone cold and defiant. Consider this a friendly warning. The voice replied, we know who you are, and we know what you're capable of. But we also know how to deal with people like you. I suggest you do what's best for yourself and your career. Forget about what happened that night and move on. The line went silent for a few seconds before disconnecting, leaving Samuel gripping the phone tightly, his thoughts racing. The message was clear. He was stirring up something that some people were willing to protect at any cost. But this only strengthened his resolve. He knew that every threat, every attempt to intimidate him, was proof that there was something rotten in the system, something that needed to be exposed. Samuel looked at Kevin, who was watching him with concern, and told him what had just happened. They're trying to scare me into backing down, he said, his voice firm. But I'm not going to stop. We're going to do this right, even if they try to cover up every piece of evidence, even if they try to silence me. They can't win. Kevin nodded, realizing there was nothing he could say to convince Samuel otherwise. He respected his colleagues' courage, but he also knew they were venturing into dangerous territory. Later that day, Samuel drove to the local police station, where the officers who had attacked him worked. It was a risky move, but he needed to send a clear message. As he walked into the building, he felt the eyes of the officers follow his steps, some filled with curiosity, others with disdain. He found the police chief, a tall and imposing man, with a thick mustache and a calculating gaze. Can I help you? The police chief said, raising his eyebrows. Samuel kept his gaze steady, not looking away. Yes, you can, he replied, pulling out a copy of his badge and placing it on the desk. I'm here to make it clear that what happened to me that night will not go unpunished. I'm a federal agent, and I am bringing an investigation into this department. Someone tampered with the security cameras to hide what happened, and that's something we are going to investigate thoroughly. I would like your cooperation, but if I don't get it, I will find other ways. The police chief looked at Samuel, his face remaining expressionless, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of irritation. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. Be careful what you're implying, Agent Reed. This is a small town, and everyone here knows each other. You're an outsider, and things can get complicated for you if you keep insisting on this path. Samuel didn't break eye contact. He knew there were risks, he knew he was alone in hostile territory, but he also knew that behind that facade of security, there was a network of fear and power that he was beginning to expose. I know exactly what I'm implying, and I also know where this is going to end, Samuel said, calmly. So, I'll ask you one more time. Will you cooperate, or will you force me to involve even more people in this matter? The police chief stared at him for a long moment before responding, his voice laden with coldness. We'll see. The office of Police Chief Henry Collins was engulfed in a tense silence after Samuel's visit. Collins was a man used to controlling what happened in Oak Ridge, a small world where his words were practically law. He sat in his leather chair with a cold, calculating expression, staring at Samuel's badge on the desk, remembering the agent's steady gaze. Samuel had stepped into his territory and, worse yet, threatened to expose something Collins had spent years controlling. That was unacceptable. Henry Collins was not a man without a history. Born and raised in Oak Ridge, he had climbed the ranks of the local police force with a mix of charisma, cunning, and, when necessary, a heavy hand. He believed he understood the rules of the game better than anyone. In a small town, the appearance of order was more important than true justice. To him, controlling the narrative was essential, and if that meant protecting certain officers, he would do it without hesitation. There was a reason he had become the police chief. He knew how to manipulate situations and people to maintain peace, at least on the surface. But Samuel Reed was a threat to that order. When he received the first phone call informing him that a stranger had been stopped by Officers Parker and Miller, he hadn't thought much of it. Arbitrary stops happened all the time, especially when it came to someone who didn't belong in the area. But when he found out that this stranger was a federal agent, his instinct for self-preservation kicked in. Collins immediately knew he needed to act quickly to prevent the situation from getting out of hand. Sitting in his chair, Collins recalled his brief conversation with Parker and Miller after the incident. They had described Samuel as defiant and insubordinate, trying to justify the aggressive approach they had taken. Collins knew their excuses were weak, but it wasn't the first time he had heard flimsy explanations from them. Miller, in particular, was known for his problematic behavior, a pit bull, as many at the station called him. That kind of behavior had caused issues before, but nothing Collins couldn't cover up. After all, he had friends in the right places, people who ensured that certain incidents never made it to the public. You're idiots, he had told the two, while they shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Do you know what it means to confront a federal agent like that? You weren't dealing with just anyone. This could turn into a serious problem for all of us. Parker, calmer than his partner, tried to argue. But, Chief, he acted like he was above the rules just because he had that badge. We couldn't just let him go and... Parker began, but was interrupted by Collins, who raised his hand, signaling him to stop. I don't care what you thought he was doing. You went too far. Collins' voice was low, but carried a tone of threat that silenced the two officers. Now we have to deal with this. Collins knew he needed to protect his men, not out of loyalty, but because admitting they had acted wrong could bring unwanted attention to his administration. He also knew that Samuel had already started asking questions, and that the situation could escalate quickly. The decision to erase the security camera footage was a desperate attempt to control the narrative. He had called a technician who was paid to do small favors for the station, and in exchange for a good sum of money, the technician ensured that the recordings from that night would disappear. But now, it seemed that strategy was backfiring. Samuel was determined, and the threat of an official FBI investigation made Collins feel, for the first time, that his control over the town was being challenged. He got up and walked to the window, looking out at the city he had protected for so long, even though he knew that this protection came at a high cost. How many times had he covered up the mistakes of his men to maintain the image of order and respect? How many times had he manipulated situations to ensure that those on his team were untouchable? Collins knew that Oak Ridge had its own rules, and those rules were dictated by those in power, and he was one of those men. There was a network of connections, from local businessmen to politicians, that maintained the status quo and ensured he could run the town with little outside interference. This was what allowed officers like Parker and Miller to act with such confidence. They knew that, in the end, Collins would be there to cover up any mistake, as long as it wasn't something that put everyone at risk. But this time, the situation was different. Samuel Reed was a problem he hadn't anticipated. A determined federal agent wasn't something he could simply ignore or silence. Collins knew he needed a new strategy. He decided he could no longer rely solely on the two officers. He would need to involve others to ensure that Samuel couldn't proceed with his investigation. He picked up the phone and called a contact, someone who had helped him in similar situations before. It was an influential lawyer who was well-versed in tactics of pressure and intimidation, someone who could help build a solid defense if the matter came to a formal hearing. After a few quick words and a mutual understanding, Collins hung up the phone, feeling a momentary sense of relief. If he could turn Samuel into an unwanted figure, a problem for the town, maybe he could divert attention from the real issue and keep things under control. Collins also knew he needed to act quickly to prevent Samuel from building a network of local support. He planned to use his connections to spread subtle rumors about Samuel, insinuating that he was trying to provoke a conflict between the police and the community, something that could make life harder for people. The strategy was simple: turn Samuel into the villain before he could expose the truth. If the town saw Samuel as an agitator, it would be easier to neutralize him. As Collins reflected on his plan, he thought about how the town of Oak Ridge had always operated according to his rules. He knew that to maintain control, he needed to act quickly and decisively. Samuel might be a federal agent, but in this town, Collins was still in charge, and he was willing to do whatever it took to ensure it stayed that way. That night, Collins met with Parker and Miller at a discreet bar on the outskirts of town. The place was known for being frequented only by trusted people, and he needed to make sure everyone was on the same page. The three men sat at a table in the back, away from prying eyes. "I need you to keep your heads cool and follow my instructions," Collins began, his tone cold and direct. "This situation can get out of hand quickly, and if that happens, we'll all pay the price. Samuel Reed can't be treated like just anyone. Do you understand what I mean?" Miller, the more impulsive of the two, tried to protest. "Chief, he's just trying to intimidate us. If we apply enough pressure, he'll back down." "No," Collins interrupted, his voice low but firm. "Don't underestimate him. He's with the FBI, and that means he has resources you can't even imagine. But he also has a weakness. He's an outsider here. Nobody knows him, and that means he doesn't have any real allies. We're going to use that to our advantage. Make sure that when he goes public, no one is willing to listen to what he has to say." Parker and Miller nodded, understanding the seriousness in Collins' voice. He had always been able to solve problems for them, and if he said this was the way, they would trust him. When they left the bar that night, Collins felt a renewed sense of control. He knew the battle was far from over, but he was determined to ensure that Samuel wouldn't find a way to expose what was behind Oak Ridge's perfect facade. As the sun set over the town, he believed he was still the master of the board, and that Samuel was just a piece he could knock down. The atmosphere in Oak Ridge was changing. Samuel could feel it as he walked through the town, passing by quiet streets and old shops. He noticed that some people were looking at him differently, with curiosity, as if they knew more than they were willing to say. He knew that since the incident with the officers, there had been a quiet attention around him. The anonymous phone call, the attempts to intimidate him, and now the feeling of being watched all indicated that he was troubling powerful people. But Samuel also knew that the only way to win was to keep pushing forward. A week after his visit to the police chief, he received a call from Kevin. Kevin's voice was more upbeat than before, a tone that Samuel hadn't heard in days. "Samuel, I have good news," Kevin began, and Samuel braced himself for what could be a rare moment of progress. "I managed to contact a special agent from headquarters who is willing to help. She has experience with cases of abuse of authority and discrimination, and she'll be arriving in town to review the situation and help us move this forward. Her name is Laura Mitchell. If we can get her support, this could change everything." Samuel felt a wave of relief wash over him. As determined as he was to go it alone, he knew he needed external help to combat the resistance he was facing in Oak Ridge. Having Laura Mitchell on his side could level the playing field, especially if she could initiate a formal federal investigation against the officers involved and potentially against the entire department. Perhaps this was the first real hope he had for justice. "That's great, Kevin," Samuel replied, a smile finally appearing on his face. "When does she arrive?" "Tomorrow afternoon. She'll meet us at the office and wants an overview of everything we have so far," Kevin explained. "But there's more. She managed to get access to some security footage from private businesses near where you were stopped. It looks like the footage wasn't tampered with, and we can use it as evidence." The news was better than Samuel had expected. If the nearby businesses' cameras had captured the stop, it would be crucial evidence to expose the officers and show how the system in Oak Ridge was trying to cover up their mistakes. He thanked Kevin for his efforts and felt, for the first time in days, a growing hope that things might finally turn in his favor. The next afternoon, Samuel went to the temporary FBI office in Oak Ridge to meet with Laura Mitchell. When she entered, he saw a woman in her 40s, with short brown hair and keen eyes. She had a professional demeanor, but there was something in the way she shook Samuel's hand that conveyed empathy and understanding. She was an experienced agent, used to handling difficult situations, and he immediately felt that he could trust her. "Samuel, it's a pleasure to finally meet you," said Laura, smiling as she sat down. "Kevin told me about the situation, and I want you to know that we're here to help. I've reviewed the preliminary information, and it looks like we have a strong case to initiate a formal investigation. Thank you for being here," Samuel replied sincerely. "It's not easy facing this alone, especially when there's such a clear attempt to cover up what happened. But with your help, I think we can finally expose the truth." They spent hours reviewing the case, going over every detail of Samuel's report and discussing how the new camera footage could be used as evidence. Laura seemed confident that they could quickly move forward to open an official investigation, and she even suggested that, with the right evidence, they could pursue immediate legal action against Parker and Miller for abuse of authority. The conversation was productive, and Samuel felt energized. It was as if he could finally see a light at the end of the tunnel. Laura assured him that with the support of headquarters, they would have the resources needed to put pressure on the Oak Ridge Police Department and ensure that the cover-up attempts were exposed. It was a solid plan, and Samuel began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were close to a victory. The next day, Laura scheduled a meeting with Police Chief Henry Collins and the local district attorney. The idea was to officially present the intention to open an investigation and give them the chance to cooperate before it became a public issue. Collins, upon receiving the news of the meeting, knew he had to attend, but he was far from unprepared. When everyone gathered in the small conference room at the temporary FBI office, the air was thick with tension. Laura and Samuel were on one side of the table, while Collins entered accompanied by a lawyer whom Samuel had not seen before. The lawyer was a middle-aged man, with a cold, calculating look, who watched Samuel as if assessing his next move. Laura began the meeting with a direct and professional tone. "Thank you for coming, Chief Collins," she said, with a diplomatic smile. "We're here to discuss a serious matter related to the actions of Officers Parker and Miller. We have evidence suggesting abuse of authority and discrimination, and we'd like to initiate a full investigation. I hope we can count on your cooperation to resolve this as transparently as possible." Collins listened quietly, his hands clasped on the table. He kept his face impassive while Laura spoke, but his eyes revealed a calculated coldness. When she finished, he smiled slightly, as if he had been expecting this moment. "Of course, Agent Mitchell, I understand the seriousness of the situation," he began, in a tone that seemed almost friendly. "But I think there might be some information that isn't quite clear to you. That's why I brought my lawyer, who would like to clarify a few things before we proceed." Collins' lawyer leaned forward, opening a folder he had brought with him. "My clients, Officers Parker and Miller, have filed a formal complaint against Agent Reed," he said, placing some papers on the table. "They claim that he was aggressive during the stop, resisted instructions, and that his behavior justified the use of force. Additionally, we have witnesses who confirm that he acted in a threatening manner during the incident." Samuel was stunned. The accusations were absurd, a clear attempt to twist the narrative and place the blame on him. He looked at Laura, who seemed as surprised as he was, but she quickly composed herself. "This is ridiculous," said Laura, trying to remain calm. We have detailed accounts from Samuel that completely contradict these accusations, as well as security footage that shows the stop. You're trying to divert attention from what really happened. Collins raised an eyebrow, maintaining his calm smile. Perhaps, Agent Mitchell, but I must remind you that these matters are delicate, he said, in an almost condescending tone. And without a complete local investigation, we can't simply accept one person's version, especially when there are allegations of misconduct. You're free to investigate, of course, but I ask that you consider the impact this will have on the community and the reputation of those involved. Samuel felt the hope he had nurtured over the past few days start to crumble. Collins' move was clear: to turn the situation into a word-against-word scenario and discredit Samuel before he could prove the truth. Even with the evidence, Collins was determined to complicate the path to justice, and now he had a lawyer to back him up. Laura leaned forward, her voice now firmer and more resolute. I understand what you're trying to do, but that won't stop us. We're going to proceed with the federal investigation, and any attempt at interference will be treated as obstruction of justice. You can make your moves, but know that we have our resources too, she said, looking directly at Collins. The meeting ended without a clear resolution. As Samuel and Laura left, he felt the frustration rising again. They had made some progress, but now they were caught in a game of manipulation and legal threats that could drag everything into a stalemate. He knew Collins wasn't going to make things easy, and this first glimmer of hope had been crushed before it could fully bloom. After the tense meeting with the police chief, Samuel and Laura returned to the temporary office, the air heavy with a sense of setback. Samuel was trying to process everything that had happened, while Laura kept a thoughtful expression, already planning the next step. It was clear that Collins was willing to fight to protect his men and his reputation, even if it meant distorting the truth. But they were not willing to give up. They needed a new approach, and that meant expanding their support network. Laura, this isn't going to be easy, Samuel said, breaking the silence. He has support here, and it's clear that he's willing to use any means to discredit us. If we keep facing this head-on, we might end up cornered. Laura nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. I know, Samuel, but I also know that the more they try to silence us, the more we can use that to our advantage. We have to play smart, not just strong. She moved closer to Samuel, placing a hand on his shoulder. We need to find allies within the community itself, people who are willing to speak out and can reinforce the legitimacy of our case. If we can show that this isn't an isolated incident, it will be much harder for them to shift the focus. Laura's idea made Samuel think. So far, he had been focused on gathering physical evidence and using the legality of the process to expose the officer's wrongdoing, but maybe he needed to approach the problem differently. To win, he would need the trust and support of the people of Oak Ridge, something that couldn't be achieved with just formal evidence, but with real human connections. This meant it was time to engage more deeply with the town and try to find those who had been silenced, just as he had been. The next day, Samuel decided to visit a local cafe located in the center of town, a place frequented by many Oak Ridge residents. The owner of the cafe, Thomas Bennett, was a middle-aged man with a friendly presence and an easy smile. Samuel had exchanged a few words with him before, but they had never really talked. Thomas seemed like the kind of person who knew everything that happened in town, someone who might have useful information, and Samuel hoped he could help him understand the local dynamics better. As soon as he entered the cafe, Samuel was greeted by Thomas, who was behind the counter preparing a coffee for a customer. He looked up and waved at Samuel with a welcoming smile. "Agent Reed, isn't it? Good to see you around. Can I get you a coffee?" Thomas asked, as he wiped his hands on a cloth. Samuel smiled and accepted the invitation, sitting on a stool at the counter. "You can call me Samuel. And yes, a coffee would be great," he said, trying to keep the tone casual. "You know, Thomas, I'm trying to understand this town better. I moved here recently, and I have to admit I've run into some challenges." Thomas let out a soft laugh, as if he knew exactly what Samuel was referring to. "Oak Ridge is a small town, Samuel, and like every small town, it has its quirks. People here are friendly, but also very reserved when they want to be." Thomas spoke with a sincerity that Samuel appreciated. "I heard you had some trouble with the police." "Sorry to hear that," Samuel sighed, thinking about how to approach the subject without alarming Thomas. It was a complicated situation. He began, slowly stirring his coffee. But it wasn't the first time something like this has happened to me, and I believe I'm not the only one who's been through it. You know this town better than I do, Thomas. Do you think this is common around here? Thomas was silent for a moment, his eyes darkening a little, as if he was pondering whether or not to speak. Finally, he sighed and leaned closer to Samuel, lowering his voice. I'll be honest with you, Samuel. The police here, they have a way of handling things that doesn't sit well with everyone. He glanced around, making sure no one was paying too much attention. I've heard stories of people being stopped without reason, treated rudely, especially people who aren't from here, or who don't look like what most people expect to see around here, if you know what I mean. Samuel nodded, feeling a pang of familiarity with Thomas's words. It was the same pattern everywhere. People who were seen as different were treated with suspicion, as if their mere presence was a threat. I understand, Samuel said, calmly. Thomas, I'm trying to do something about it. And for that, I need to know if there are people willing to talk about their experiences. I'm not asking anyone to put themselves at risk, but if there's anything that could help me, anything at all, it would be a big step toward ensuring no one else has to go through this. Thomas seemed to consider Samuel's words, then smiled, a sad smile, like someone who knew much more than he would like to. I'll tell you this, Samuel. There's a woman named Marlene who's lived here for decades. She's had problems with the police in the past because of her son. I know she tried to do something about it, but she was ignored. Maybe she would be willing to talk to you. I'll see if I can reach out to her, and if she agrees, I'll let you know. Samuel thanked him sincerely, and as he finished his coffee, he felt that he had taken an important step. It might be a small advance, but every little step was crucial. He knew it wouldn't be easy to convince people to speak up, especially if they feared retaliation, but it was a path he needed to explore. A few days later, Samuel received a message from Thomas. Marlene had agreed to meet him at the town park to talk. He arrived at the agreed time and saw a woman with graying hair and tired eyes waiting on a bench, watching the trees sway gently in the wind. Samuel approached and introduced himself, trying to convey the calm and respect he knew she needed to feel to open up. Thomas told me you wanted to talk, said Marlene, without preamble. I don't like talking about these things, but if you think you can help, I'll try. Samuel sat down next to her and listened as Marlene told the story of her son, Jamal. Years ago, Jamal had been stopped by local police while driving home after a basketball game. They accused him of driving drunk, even though he hadn't been drinking, and when he tried to explain, he was dragged out of the car and assaulted. Marlene tried to take the case forward, but she found doors closed everywhere. At the police station, in court, and even with the local media. They wanted me to stay quiet. They said it was better for everyone if I didn't make a fuss. But it destroyed my son. He was never the same after that. Marlene said, her voice choked with emotion. And I feel powerless. Because they do this, and nobody cares. Samuel felt a lump in his throat as he listened to Marlene. Jamal's story was no different from so many others he had encountered in his career, and hearing it only reinforced his resolve. He thanked her for sharing her story and assured her that he would use the information to build a stronger case. They needed voices like hers to show that the problem went beyond a single wrongful stop, that there was a pattern of behavior that needed to be exposed. I know it's hard, Marlene, but if we can do this, maybe we can make sure no one else has to go through what your son did, Samuel said, looking directly into her eyes. If I have to fight alone, I will. But I will fight for everyone who has been silenced by this injustice. Marlene nodded, and Samuel saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes, even if it was just a flicker. It was a beginning, and he knew the fight was just starting. They had a long way to go, but now he was no longer alone. The sense of progress that Samuel had gained by connecting with Marlene and other members of the community quickly began to crumble when a new, unexpected obstacle emerged. Days after his conversation with Marlene, Samuel received a disturbing phone call from Laura while he was at the temporary FBI office. Samuel, we have a serious problem, said Laura, her voice tense and lacking its usual confidence. One of the lawyers representing the police department managed to get a court injunction that temporarily limits our investigation. They claimed we're acting outside of our jurisdiction and that we can't proceed without formal authorization from a judge. Samuel felt his stomach sink. The injunction was a maneuver to stall the investigation, a legal blockade that could drag the case out for weeks or even months while the judicial system decided whether they could continue. And during that time, those involved would have the chance to destroy more evidence and manipulate the narrative further. How is this possible? Samuel asked, trying to process the situation. They can't just block a federal investigation like this. There's a clear case of obstruction of justice here, Laura. I know, but they're using every tactic they have to buy time. Laura replied, with a frustrated sigh. And it seems the judge who signed the injunction has a close relationship with the police chief. It's all starting to connect. They're using their network of influence to block us, and meanwhile, they're trying to undermine our credibility. Samuel closed his eyes, trying to stay calm. He knew that challenging the system meant facing an intricate network of alliances and favors, but he hadn't anticipated that they would be able to manipulate the law to impede the investigation this way. He needed to find a way around the blockade, but the frustration of seeing justice being distorted to protect those who abused their power was almost unbearable. As Samuel and Laura discussed the implications of the injunction, another complication arose. Kevin walked into the office with a grim expression, carrying an envelope that appeared to have been delivered by hand. "Samuel, this came for you," said Kevin, handing over the envelope. "And it wasn't sent by mail. Someone left it at the reception." Samuel opened the envelope and found a typewritten letter. The words, precise and devoid of emotion, were clearly meant to intimidate him. "Agent Reed, this is your last chance to drop this. We know you're trying to connect with people in the community, but I want you to know that you are being watched. If you continue to poke around where you shouldn't, we'll make sure there's no one left to support you. There are things you don't understand, and if you're smart, you'll get back in line before it's too late." The letter was a clear and direct threat, meant to scare him into giving up. Samuel showed the paper to Laura and Kevin, who read it in silence, their expressions filled with concern. "This is more proof that we're dealing with something bigger than just two abusive cops," said Samuel, trying to keep his voice steady, despite the anger and frustration boiling inside him. "They're willing to intimidate, manipulate, and threaten to protect their system." Laura nodded, but Samuel could see that she was worried too. If their enemies were capable of influencing the judicial system and directly threatening a federal agent, it meant they were dealing with a well-established and powerful network. The situation was becoming more complicated and dangerous than they had imagined. "We need to find a way around this injunction and keep the investigation going," said Laura, trying to come up with a plan. "And we need to start documenting these threats. This is a clear sign of obstruction of justice and witness intimidation, and we can use it to strengthen the case. But in the meantime, we have to be careful. They're trying to isolate you, Samuel." That night, as Samuel was preparing to leave the office, he received a call from Thomas Bennett, the cafe owner who had helped him connect with Marlene. Thomas's voice was full of urgency and concern. "Samuel, do you have a minute?" Thomas asked, clearly disturbed. "I need to talk to you about something important." "Sure, Thomas. What happened?" Samuel asked, feeling a twinge of apprehension. "I spoke to Marlene today, and she's scared," said Thomas, his voice low and cautious. "She told me that she received a visit from two men who introduced themselves as independent investigators. They started asking questions about you, about what she told you. And when she hesitated to respond, they made it clear that it would be better for her and her son if she stayed out of this." Samuel felt a wave of fury surge through him. The men were trying to silence the people in town, exactly as he had feared. It was a classic intimidation tactic to ensure that no one dared to support his cause. But it also meant they were desperate, that they feared what Samuel might expose. "Thomas, I need to know if Marlene is safe," said Samuel, his voice firm. "She needs to understand that these men have no right to intimidate her. I'll make sure she's protected, but I need her to stay strong and willing to speak out. Otherwise, they win." "She's scared, Samuel, but I think you're right. They know that if more people speak up, things can change. I'll talk to her and see if I can convince her not to back down." Thomas responded, trying to sound confident, but Samuel could hear the fear in his words. As he hung up, Samuel knew that the new obstacle was much more than a court injunction. He was fighting against a network of power that had no qualms about using fear to maintain its hold. This meant he would need to step up his approach and find a way to protect those who were beginning to trust him and share their stories. The next morning, Samuel and Laura met again to discuss strategy. Laura was looking into legal options to challenge the injunction, while Samuel was thinking about how to strengthen his position within the community. They needed to find a way to make sure that stories like Marlene's were heard, even if the men trying to intimidate them were trying to silence them. If we can get significant support from the community, we can show that the problem is systemic, not just an isolated case, said Samuel, with a determined expression. We need to bring national media attention to Oak Ridge. If we can get journalists to come and start investigating, it will be much harder for Collins and his allies to hide what's going on. Laura agreed, realizing that Samuel's approach made sense. They needed to change the narrative and take control away from Collins. Bringing outside attention to what was happening in Oak Ridge was risky, but it was the only way to break the cycle of intimidation that the local system was using against them. In the days that followed, Samuel began reaching out to journalists he knew from previous investigations. He knew he had to be careful not to draw negative attention to Marlene and others who could become targets, but he also knew that a story exposing the network of corruption and abuse could be the weapon they needed to break the hold that Collins had created. The days following Samuel's decision to involve the national media were marked by growing tension. He continued to work at the temporary FBI office in Oak Ridge, but the sense of surveillance and isolation only increased. Whenever he went out for coffee or to the grocery store, he could feel people's eyes fixed on him. Some were curious, others clearly hostile, but the most unsettling were the empty stares, as if people had already accepted that nothing would change in the town, no matter what he did. Meanwhile, Laura was trying to navigate the legal maze to challenge the injunction that was blocking their investigation. The evidence was there, the stories of abuse were beginning to emerge, but the system kept erecting barriers, one after another. Samuel knew the fight wouldn't be easy, but what troubled him most was the realization that he was putting other people in danger. The threat against Marlene and the increasing intimidation of his allies were a burden he carried every day, and he started to wonder if he was doing the right thing by persisting. One of those moments of doubt caught him by surprise while he was sitting in his car, parked on a street near the park where he had met with Marlene. He was alone, lost in thought, when he felt his phone vibrate. It was a message from an unknown number. He hesitated before opening it, expecting another veiled threat, but what he saw intrigued him. Not everyone here is your enemy. Sometimes the walls have ears, and this time, maybe someone is willing to listen. Look for the Rosewood Inn. Samuel frowned, trying to decipher the message. The Rosewood Inn was an old guest house in the town center, a discreet place usually frequented by travelers looking for a more welcoming and intimate experience than a standard hotel. He had no idea who could have sent the message, but he felt he had nothing to lose by investigating. When he arrived at the inn, he was greeted by an elderly receptionist who seemed to be expecting him. She smiled, as if she knew exactly who he was and why he was there. "Good afternoon, Mr. Reed. We have a room reserved for you. Please, follow me," she said, with a gentle but firm tone. Samuel followed the woman down the quiet corridors of the inn until she stopped in front of a door and slowly opened it. Inside the room, sitting in a comfortable armchair, was a middle-aged woman with dark hair pulled back and an intense look that scrutinized Samuel carefully. He entered hesitantly, sensing that there was something unusual about the situation, but also a feeling of opportunity, as if he was about to discover something important. "I'm Rose Parker," the woman said, standing up and extending her hand to him. "And I believe you're looking for answers that no one here is willing to give. Maybe I can help with that." Samuel shook her hand, confused but determined to find out what was going on. "Are you related to Officer Parker?" he asked, recalling the name. "Yes, he's my nephew," Rose replied, with a slight expression of sadness. "And before you ask, I'm not here to defend him. In fact, I'm here because I think he and the others have a lot to answer for." Samuel felt a wave of surprise. What Rose was suggesting was dangerous, especially for someone who had family ties to one of the officers involved. But he also knew she could be the key to uncovering more about what was happening inside the police department. He sat down, waiting for her to explain further. My brother, Parker's father, is an influential man in this town. He has always made sure our family had a prominent role in Oak Ridge, said Rose, her tone oscillating between sadness and frustration. That meant maintaining alliances with people like Henry Collins. For years, they have controlled the town, and anyone who tried to question them was silenced or discredited. I try to keep my nephew away from this, but he grew up with the mentality that being in power means being above the rules. Rose continued, revealing details about how Collins and his allies used their power to manipulate the system. She mentioned that it wasn't uncommon for the police department to do favors for certain local figures, ensuring that cases disappeared or were softened before they became bigger problems. Henry Collins' name appeared in all these schemes, and Rose explained that, over the years, he had become a kind of guardian of a privilege system that kept the powerful untouchable. I know he won't stop at anything to maintain control, she said, looking directly at Samuel. But I also know that I can't stay silent anymore. If they're willing to threaten you and other people, it's because they're afraid, and fear means they're vulnerable. Samuel listened in silence, absorbing every word. He hadn't expected to find an ally within the very family of one of the officers who had been involved in the abusive stop, but now he saw an opportunity. Rose could provide insights and information that would be impossible to obtain otherwise. If you want to change things here, you need to show that you're not alone. Rose continued, I can put you in touch with others who have stories to tell, people who have been wronged by this system but never had the chance to speak up. But you need to be careful. Every move you make will be watched, and they won't hesitate to turn the town against you if they get the chance. Samuel thanked Rose for her courage and her willingness to help. He knew it wouldn't be easy for her, considering her family connections. But the fact that she had taken this step was a sign that the tide was changing, even if slowly. They exchanged contact information, and Rose promised to reach out in the coming days with more details and potential allies. However, as Samuel drove back to the office, the sense of relief was mixed with a growing anxiety. He had taken an important step by gaining Rose's trust, but the presence of a network of intimidation and corruption in Oak Ridge was deeper and more complex than he had imagined. With every new layer he uncovered, it became clearer that Henry Collins and his allies were prepared to fight to the end to maintain their position of power. When Samuel arrived at the office, he found Kevin waiting for him, holding a set of papers that appeared to be recent reports. Samuel, I was about to call you. We received some interesting information from one of the local businesses that has security cameras near the area where you were stopped, said Kevin, showing the papers. It seems someone tried to erase more footage after we got the first ones. They're trying to cover their tracks, but this only proves that something is very wrong here. Samuel flipped through the reports, seeing the evidence of tampering with the recordings. The proof that someone was actively trying to erase records was an important reinforcement for their case. But it was also an indication that the enemies they were facing were meticulous and willing to do anything to hide the truth. This is good, Kevin, said Samuel, feeling a mix of relief and concern. We can use this to strengthen our request for an investigation, but we need to move fast. If they think we're getting too close, they'll try something bigger to stop us. Samuel knew that the next steps would be crucial. He had to use the new information from Rose to expand his reach in the community and find allies willing to speak out. He needed to make sure that the stories of the people of Oak Ridge were heard before Collins and his allies could suppress everything again. He was closer than ever to exposing what was really happening in the town. But he also knew the danger was growing. It was a race against time, and the next move would be decisive. The meeting with Rose and the new evidence about the manipulation of the cameras had strengthened Samuel's resolve. He knew he was getting close to something important, something that Henry Collins and his allies were desperate to hide. But he also knew that getting closer to the truth meant that the resistance would become even fiercer. Samuel would need to plan his next move carefully, because the risk of a direct attack against him and his allies was higher than ever. The next morning, Samuel received an unexpected call from Laura. She sounded worried, almost alarmed. Samuel, I just got a call from Chief Collins. He wants to meet with you personally at the police station. He suggested that it would be in everyone's interest to resolve this before it becomes a bigger problem, said Laura, with a hint of disbelief in her voice. I don't like this. It sounds like a trap. Samuel agreed. A direct invitation from Collins was suspicious, especially given the current tension and the police chief's attempts to discredit him. But Samuel also knew that he needed to confront Collins again, this time armed with the information he had gathered and ready to force the antagonist to show his hand. "I'll go," said Samuel, determined, "but I want you and Kevin to stay alert. If I don't make contact within an hour, I want you to start taking action. We can't let them isolate me or try to intimidate me into backing down." Laura hesitated for a moment before agreeing. "Be careful, Samuel. They're not playing games. And if Collins is calling you to the station, it's because he thinks he has the upper hand," she said. "But I'll be on standby. If you need backup, I'll make sure he gets more than he bargained for." Samuel drove to the police station, his heart beating a bit faster with every mile he got closer. He knew that Collins had control of the territory and that a meeting there meant facing the police chief on his own turf. When he entered the building, he could feel the officers' eyes following his movements. Some seemed indifferent, but others had a look of disdain, as if they knew Samuel was being invited to a confrontation he couldn't win. He was led to a meeting room at the back of the station, where Collins was already waiting for him. The police chief was sitting calmly at the table, an almost friendly smile on his face, as if he was preparing for a casual conversation. But Samuel knew that this was the expression of a man who planned to use every card he had to maintain control of the situation. "Agent Reed, thank you for accepting my invitation," said Collins in a polite, almost cordial tone. "I thought we could have a straightforward conversation and resolve this without further complications." Samuel sat down across from Collins, keeping a neutral expression, not revealing the emotions bubbling inside him. "I also prefer to resolve this directly, Collins," Samuel responded with a cold calmness. "But that will only be possible if there's transparency. And so far, that seems to be the last thing you want." Collins chuckled softly, as if he found Samuel's answer amusing. He opened a folder that was on the table and began to leaf through some documents, unhurriedly. "Transparency? It's an interesting word, Samuel," said Collins, raising his eyes to meet Samuel's. "I have been transparent with this town for years. People know they can trust me to keep order. But when outsiders come in, trying to create chaos and disorder, well, that's something we need to avoid." Samuel knew exactly where Collins was going. He wanted to paint Samuel as the outsider, as someone who didn't understand the dynamics of Oak Ridge and who was trying to disrupt an order that Collins had spent years cultivating. It was an attempt to shift the narrative and, at the same time, undermine Samuel's position as someone who was simply trying to help. If keeping order means hiding abuses of power and threatening those who try to expose the truth, then you have a very peculiar definition of transparency, Collins. Samuel responded, firmly. "You know as well as I do that your men crossed a line. And it wasn't the first time. You can try to intimidate me, but I won't stop seeking justice, and now I have more people willing to speak up." The smile on Collins' face faded, and his expression turned more serious, almost threatening. He knew Samuel was right, but he also knew he had resources to make things difficult. Collins wasn't used to losing and didn't intend to start now. "I don't think you understand how things work around here, Samuel," he said, leaning forward, his tone lower and laced with menace. "This town is my responsibility, and I'm going to make sure it stays that way. You may think you have allies, but when the time comes, they won't be there for you. People are loyal to those who protect them, and I'm the one who protects this town, not you." Samuel looked directly into Collins' eyes, feeling the tension between them grow. He knew Collins was trying to test him, gauge his level of commitment, and look for a weakness to exploit. But he also knew he couldn't back down. "Then tell me, Collins, do you protect the town, or do you protect your men? Because there's a big difference," said Samuel, his words sharp as blades. "If protecting this town means allowing officers to act with impunity, using intimidation and abuse, then that's not protection. It's tyranny." Collins slammed his hand on the table, his calm finally breaking. The sound echoed through the room, and for a moment, there was only silence. When he spoke again, his voice was colder, almost venomous. "Careful, Agent Reed," he said, pointing a finger at Samuel. "You're treading on dangerous ground. I can make your life here a living hell. I can ensure that you lose any support you've managed to find and that no one, not even your agency, will want to get involved in this case. I've seen others try to do what you're doing, and they all failed." Samuel felt the anger building up, but he kept his composure. He knew Collins was trying to provoke him, make him lose his cool. But Samuel wasn't a man who was easily intimidated, and he refused to let Collins control the conversation. "Then I'll be the first not to fail," said Samuel, his voice firm and unwavering. "You can try to silence me, Collins, but I'm not the only one seeing what's happening. There are people willing to fight against this corruption. You may have the support of some, but others are beginning to see the truth, and you can't hide the truth forever." Collins looked at Samuel, his eyes narrowing, as if evaluating every word. Finally, he smiled, but it was a cold smile, devoid of joy. "Maybe you're right, Samuel. Maybe the truth will come out eventually," he said, slowly standing up. "But even if it does, you have to ask yourself, at what cost? Are you willing to sacrifice yourself and everyone who cares about you to prove a point? Because I guarantee, I'm willing to do whatever it takes to keep this town the way it's always been." Samuel stood up too, feeling that the conversation had come to an end. He knew there was nothing more to say to Collins at that moment, but he also knew he wouldn't walk out of there intimidated. Collins wanted him to know that there would be consequences for his actions, but Samuel was prepared to face them. "If protecting this town means silencing those who seek justice, then you're not protecting anyone," said Samuel, looking directly at Collins. "You're only protecting yourself, and that will end. I'll make sure of it." The two men stared at each other for a moment before Samuel turned and left the room, leaving Collins alone. As he walked through the halls of the station, he knew that the confrontation had been just a preview of what was to come. But he also knew he was no longer alone, and that, with every new step, he was getting closer to exposing the true face of Henry Collins and the system he had built. After the tense encounter with Henry Collins, Samuel left the police station with a renewed sense of urgency. He knew that the conversation had revealed Collins' willingness to use all means necessary to maintain control and silence any attempt to expose the truth. Samuel needed to act quickly to ensure that, when the truth came to light, it would be so undeniable that Collins and his allies could no longer cover up their actions. In the following days, Samuel and Laura intensified their efforts to gather all the evidence they could. Laura was working to bypass the court injunction that had temporarily blocked the investigation, exploring every legal loophole possible. She also began drafting a formal communication to the FBI headquarters, detailing all the obstruction and manipulation attempts they had encountered, hoping to secure support for a more direct and official intervention. Meanwhile, Samuel redoubled his efforts to connect with members of the Oak Ridge community. He knew that the key to dismantling Collins' system was ensuring that the victims' voices were heard, that the stories of abuse and intimidation became impossible to ignore. And for that, he needed to build a local support network that could withstand attempts at silencing and manipulation. Samuel decided to organize a meeting at the Rosewood Inn, the same inn where he had met Rose Parker. He asked Rose to reach out to some of the people who had been wronged by Collins and the police department, inviting them to come together and discuss the possibility of a collective effort to challenge the system. He knew that many would be afraid, and that Collins' threats still loomed over them, but he hoped that by uniting, they could find the strength to fight. The night of the meeting arrived, and Samuel felt anxious as he waited in the small conference room that Rose had reserved. He didn't know how many people would show up, but he knew it was a decisive moment. The door opened, and one by one, they began to enter. Familiar and unfamiliar faces, people who had been victims of police abuse, intimidation, and manipulation. Among them were Thomas Bennett, Marlene, and others Samuel recognized from his previous encounters in town. But there were also new faces, some he had never seen before, and this gave him hope. Rose was the last to enter, closing the door behind her. She looked at Samuel and nodded, as if to say it was time to start. Samuel stood up and looked at the group, trying to convey calm and confidence. "Thank you all for coming. I know this is not an easy situation, and that many of you have reasons to be afraid of getting involved. But I want you to know that you are not alone." Samuel began, his voice firm but filled with empathy. "I am a stranger here, but what I have seen in Oak Ridge has shown me that there is a system of power acting wrongfully. They want all of us to stay silent, to accept what happens and let them continue. But if we are here tonight, It's because we know this needs to stop." There was a brief silence after his words, and Samuel could feel the tension in the room. He knew it was a delicate moment. If he could gain their trust, he could take the next step in the fight against Collins. If he failed, the movement he was trying to build could fall apart before it even started. Thomas was the first to speak, breaking the silence. "I've known this town my whole life, and I know things have never changed," he said, his voice heavy with fatigue, but also with a quiet determination. "But maybe it's time to try something new. I believe in you, Samuel. If there's a chance to make this right, I'm with you." Thomas's words seemed to break an invisible barrier, and others began to speak, sharing their stories and expressing their support. Marlene talked about what had happened to her son and how she had never found justice. Others recounted incidents of intimidation and manipulation they had endured over the years, all cases that had been ignored, silenced, or resolved informally to maintain the image of order that Collins had cultivated. Rose stood up and spoke as well, her words calm but firm. "I know many of you are afraid, and rightfully so. Collins has a lot of power here, and he knows how to use it to keep things the way he wants. But I also know that if we keep letting this happen, he will only get stronger. He's already starting to show signs of fear, and that's why he's trying to intimidate all of us. He knows that if we all speak up together, he won't be able to silence us," she said, looking at Samuel and then at the group. "I'm willing to take the risk, because if we don't do this now, I don't know if anyone else will ever get the chance to try again." Samuel felt a wave of relief and gratitude. Rose was right. Collins was beginning to lose control, and that was a sign that they were on the right path. He knew he needed to seize the moment and turn this meeting into a movement of action. "Thank you, Rose, and thank you all," said Samuel, looking around at the group. "The next step is to make sure your stories are heard, not just here, but across the country. I'm working to bring journalists and investigators from outside to make sure what happens here in Oak Ridge is exposed, so no one can hide the truth. And if you're willing to join me, we can finally start to change things." Samuel's plan was simple but bold. He knew that bringing national media attention to Oak Ridge would mean drawing the ire of Collins and everyone who relied on him to maintain their positions of power. But he also knew that once light was shed on the darkness Collins had created, there would be no turning back. As the meeting continued, people began sharing contacts, exchanging information, and planning strategies to ensure their voices were heard. Samuel saw hope grow in those who had once felt powerless, and it gave him the strength he needed to keep fighting. He knew there was still much to be done, but he felt he was building a solid foundation for the battle ahead. The next morning, Samuel received a call from Laura, who had some news. "Samuel, I just got a positive response from one of the journalists you reached out to. They want to come to Oak Ridge and start investigating," she said, excited. "And more, I managed to convince headquarters to give us more support. If we can keep up the momentum, we might finally have a real chance to expose Collins and everything he's been hiding." Samuel took a deep breath, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. Everything was starting to fall into place, but he also knew this meant Collins wouldn't just stand still. He would need to be prepared for any retaliation, any attempt to destroy the movement they were building. The real battle was still ahead, and he had to make sure they were ready to face it. The arrival of journalists in Oak Ridge marked the beginning of a new phase in Samuel's battle against Collins. As reporters and film crews started moving around the town, asking questions and collecting testimonies, the tension in the air grew thicker. People were speaking up, some for the first time, and their stories began to surface, painting a clear and disturbing picture of the abuse of power that Collins and his network had maintained for so long. Samuel watched closely as everything unfolded, knowing that every interview, every recording, every word spoken was a step closer to exposing the truth. But he also knew that Collins would not sit idly by. He anticipated a response, a desperate attempt to stem the tide that was starting to turn against him. That response came on a cloudy morning when Samuel was informed by Laura that Henry Collins had called a press conference at the police station. She had received a brief, cold statement indicating that Collins had important information to share and wanted to clear up any misunderstandings that might be spreading. Samuel knew this was a strategic move. Collins wanted to take control of the narrative before the reports came out and shed light on his actions. "Samuel, you know what this means," Laura said over the phone, her voice heavy with concern. "He's going to try to discredit you and everyone on your side. He'll make it seem like all this is an unfounded attack against him and the police. If he manages to shift the narrative, it could be very hard to regain the momentum we've built." Samuel thought for a moment before responding. He knew he had to be present at Collins' press conference, that he needed to confront him publicly and expose the lies before the police chief had a chance to manipulate the situation in his favor. "I'll be there," said Samuel, determined, "and I'll make sure Collins doesn't have the last word. If he wants a confrontation, that's what he's going to get." The police station's conference room was packed when Samuel arrived. Local and national journalists had gathered, cameras were set up, and microphones were ready to catch every sound. Collins stood at the center of the stage, wearing a pristine uniform and an expression that mixed seriousness with calm, as if he was handling a simple administrative issue, not a storm of accusations. When Collins began to speak, his voice was firm and controlled, clearly rehearsed to project confidence and authority. "I know that in recent days, a lot of information has come out that has placed the Oak Ridge Police Department under severe scrutiny," he began, looking directly at the cameras. "And I want to make it clear that we are committed to transparency and justice. Any allegations of misconduct will be investigated, but we cannot allow unfounded accusations to undermine the hard work of the officers who risk their lives every day to protect this community." Samuel felt his stomach churn as he listened to Collins' carefully chosen words. He was turning the criticism into an attack on the integrity of the police, trying to flip the narrative and paint those speaking out against him as agitators who wanted to sow discord. It was a classic tactic, and it worked well, especially in a small town where many still believed in the myth of the protection that Collins claimed to provide. Recently, a federal agent from outside our town has been leading a campaign to discredit our department, basing it on unverified allegations and manipulating situations to make it appear as if there is a systemic problem here. Collins continued, pausing to let his words sink in. "I want to assure everyone that we are cooperating with federal authorities and that the truth will prevail. We have nothing to hide." Samuel knew this was the moment. He stood up and walked to the front of the room, all eyes turning towards him. Collins hesitated when he saw him, but kept his composure, as if he was prepared for the confrontation. Samuel took a microphone from one of the journalists and turned to face Collins directly, the tension between the two palpable. "Collins, you talk about transparency, but everything you've done so far has been to try to cover up the truth," said Samuel, his voice clear and firm, cutting through the silence in the room. "From the beginning, you have tried to manipulate evidence, intimidate witnesses, and use your influence to block any attempt at justice. You say you have nothing to hide, but what I see is someone desperate to maintain control at any cost." Collins tried to maintain his cold smile, but Samuel could see the irritation growing in his eyes. He hadn't expected such a direct and public confrontation, and it left him momentarily speechless. "The accusations you're making are serious, Agent Reed," said Collins, trying to regain control. "And if you have evidence, then let it be presented. But I won't stand by while judgments are made based on rumors and manipulation." Samuel knew this was the decisive moment. He had to unmask Collins, to expose the truth so clearly that no one could ignore it. He turned to the journalists and began to speak. "I do have evidence," said Samuel, pulling a folder out of his briefcase and holding it up for everyone to see. "We have testimonies from victims who were abused and intimidated by officers under your leadership. We have footage from cameras that were tampered with to hide your actions. And we have evidence that you tried to use your influence to block a legitimate federal investigation. All of this evidence will be released to the press and the public. And this time, you won't be able to hide it." The room erupted into murmurs, journalists beginning to ask questions and cameras zooming in on Samuel as he handed the evidence to one of the reporters in the front row. Collins tried to speak, but his voice was drowned out by the noise, his attempt to control the narrative crumbling before his eyes. He slammed his hand on the table, trying to regain order, but the confidence he had displayed at the start of the press conference was quickly unraveling. "This is outrageous," shouted Collins, trying to make his voice heard above the chaos. "You are using dirty tactics to destroy the reputation of honest men who serve this town. None of this has been proven." "It will be, Collins," Samuel responded, turning to face him again. Because now the investigation is out of your control. You tried to silence the truth, but it's coming out. And you better be prepared to answer for everything you've done. The tension in the room peaked, with journalists asking questions frantically and camera flashes capturing every moment of the confrontation. Samuel knew he had achieved what he wanted. He had publicly exposed Collins, challenged his authority, and shown that the fight for justice would not be silenced. Collins tried to maintain his composure, but the reporters did not relent, bombarding him with questions he could no longer avoid. He knew the net was closing in, that the narrative he had controlled for so long was breaking apart. And Samuel, now more determined than ever, knew that he had changed the course of the battle. As the press conference descended into chaos, Samuel stepped back, leaving Collins to deal with the storm he had created. He knew this wasn't the end. Collins would still have resources to fight, and there would be more obstacles ahead. But for the first time, the truth was out, visible for everyone to see. And that was something Collins could no longer hide or control. After the chaotic press conference, Samuel knew he had set off a chain reaction that would be difficult to contain. In the days that followed, stories of abuse of power and corruption in Oak Ridge began to spread across national news outlets, gaining more and more attention. The evidence Samuel presented was analyzed by independent journalists, who corroborated his claims and expanded the coverage, revealing a system of corruption that involved not only the police but also influential figures in local politics. The impact was immediate. The Oak Ridge Police Department began to feel pressure from all sides. Collins, who had dominated the narrative for so long, now found himself desperately trying to defend himself as his actions were questioned by reporters and external officials. The situation had dramatically shifted, and the sense of security he had in his position began to crumble. Samuel and Laura continued to work tirelessly to strengthen the case. With the support of the media, more victims began to come forward, sharing their stories of abuse and intimidation. What once appeared to be isolated incidents was starting to form a clear and consistent pattern of misconduct, and Collins' narrative that it was all an unfounded campaign could no longer hold. But despite all the progress, Samuel knew he couldn't let his guard down. Collins was still an influential and dangerous man, and he still had allies willing to protect the system. Then, on a rainy afternoon, Samuel received an unexpected call from Rose Parker. Her voice was tense, almost desperate, as if she was trying to stay calm despite a chaotic situation. "Samuel, you need to know something," she began, panting. "Collins is planning one last move. I don't know all the details, but I heard about a secret meeting happening tonight. He and some of his closest allies are going to meet to try and clean up whatever they can before things get even more out of control. I think they're planning to destroy evidence and silence some people before this goes any further." Rose's warning was a clear sign that Collins was desperate. If he was planning a secret meeting to manipulate the situation, it meant he still believed he could control the narrative and eliminate the remaining threats. Samuel knew he needed to act immediately. This was an opportunity to catch Collins and his allies red-handed, once and for all. "Rose, do you know where this meeting is going to be?" Samuel asked, already starting to think about how he could organize a swift intervention. "It's going to be at the home of one of the local businessmen, Mark Whitfield," Rose said. "He's one of Collins' biggest supporters and has a lot to lose if this continues. They plan to meet there to discuss how they're going to move forward." Samuel thanked Rose and immediately contacted Laura, explaining the situation. They needed a plan, and they needed one quickly. If they could gather evidence of Collins and his allies attempting to obstruct justice, it would be the final blow they needed to bring down the entire system. "We're going to involve the FBI headquarters and make sure we have an official operation ready to intercept this meeting," said Laura, her voice filled with determination. "If we can catch them in the act, there'll be no way for them to escape. I'll contact the higher-ups and get everything organized for tonight." As night approached, Samuel prepared for what he knew would be one of the most important operations of his career. He joined a team of FBI agents who had been mobilized to monitor Mark Whitfield's house, where the secret meeting was to take place. They positioned vehicles discreetly around the area, ready to move in at the right moment. Samuel felt the tension in the air, knowing that what happened that night could determine the final outcome of his entire struggle. Around 9 p.m., cars began arriving at Whitfield's house. Samuel watched closely as he recognized some of the figures stepping out of the vehicles. Men he knew were connected to Collins and the corrupt system he controlled. Collins was the last to arrive, stepping out of his car with a stern expression, like someone who knew he had to pull off the impossible to save his own skin. Samuel's team waited, watching the movements inside the house. They had authorization to act the moment they confirmed an attempt to destroy evidence or any activity that could be considered obstruction of justice. For nearly an hour, there was silence, just shadows moving across the windows of the house. Then, finally, one of the agents monitoring the situation whispered over the radio, "We have visual on a group in the office. Looks like they're burning documents. Several papers are being destroyed. They're trying to eliminate the evidence." That was enough to trigger the operation. Samuel gave the signal, and the FBI team advanced, surrounding the house and moving in quickly. The sound of hurried footsteps and sharp commands echoed across the property as the agents moved with precision and coordination. When they entered the office, they found Collins and his allies around a fireplace, where piles of documents were already being burned. "Freeze! FBI!" Samuel shouted as the agents entered and took control of the room. "You are all in custody for attempting to obstruct justice and destroying evidence. Step away from the fireplace now." Collins looked at Samuel with a mix of shock and rage, as if he couldn't believe he had been caught. For a moment, he seemed to try to compose himself, but the words died in his throat. The other men around him were equally stunned, their attempts to save themselves abruptly interrupted. Samuel watched as the agents handcuffed Collins and the others, and for the first time, he saw the man who had been his antagonist finally lose control. "You think this is going to change anything, Reed?" Collins said, his voice dripping with disdain as the agents escorted him out of the office. "I still have allies. You can't bring it all down. You're going to lose, just like everyone else." Samuel stepped closer, looking him straight in the eye. "Maybe I can't bring it all down alone, but this time, you're not going to escape," Samuel said, with unwavering firmness. "And what I've started, others will finish. Your time is up." The operation was a success, and Collins, along with several of his closest allies, was taken into custody. The FBI agents seized the remaining documents and ensured that evidence of the destruction and manipulation was preserved for use in the case. The next day, news of Collins' arrest spread throughout Oak Ridge and beyond, causing a wave of shock that reverberated across the town. It was the beginning of the end for the corrupt system that had been exposed. The news of Henry Collins' arrest, along with his allies, spread quickly through Oak Ridge and garnered national attention. The system of corruption and abuse of power, which had been protected for so long, was finally exposed, and the reactions were immediate and varied. For some, the revelation was a shock, a complete dismantling of the image of order and security that Collins had carefully cultivated. For others, it was a release, a validation of a feeling they had carried for years that something was deeply wrong in the town. Samuel sat in the conference room of the temporary FBI office, watching as the news highlighted the developments of the story. Pictures of Collins being taken into custody flashed on the screens, along with statements from political figures and community leaders. The news was impactful, but Samuel knew the fight wouldn't end there. There was still much to be done to ensure that the changes were permanent and that the culture of impunity would not take root in Oak Ridge again. As he reflected on everything that had happened, the door opened and Laura walked in, bringing with her an expression of satisfaction that he hadn't seen in a long time. "You did it, Samuel," she said, sitting next to him. "We managed to expose the system, and finally, we have Collins where he belongs. This wouldn't have been possible without you." Samuel gave a slight smile, but there was an underlying sadness in his expression. He knew that many people had suffered before justice began to be served, and that the path to real change would still be long and difficult. He looked at Laura, trying to find the right words to express how he felt. "I just did what was right," he finally replied. "But there's still a lot to be done. Collins may be in jail, but there are other people involved who will try to salvage what they can from this system. We can't let our guard down now." Laura nodded, understanding what Samuel meant. She also knew their work wasn't complete, but that moment was an important step, a victory they needed to acknowledge. "I spoke with headquarters this morning," she said, shifting the subject. The case will continue to be investigated, and everyone involved will be held accountable. And more than that, they want to establish a stronger presence here to ensure that the Oak Ridge Police Department is reformed and monitored. This news gave Samuel a sense of relief. He knew that simply removing Collins wouldn't be enough. Structural change would be necessary to ensure that nothing similar would happen again. With the support of the FBI and other external organizations, there was hope that Oak Ridge could truly become a town where justice prevailed. In the following days, the town underwent a process of collective introspection. Samuel and his team organized sessions to allow victims to speak openly about their experiences, not only to record testimonies, but to create a space where people could begin to heal their wounds. It was an emotionally intense process, and Samuel participated in every session, listening patiently as people of all ages and backgrounds shared their stories of abuse, fear, and resilience. One of these sessions was particularly poignant. Marlene, who had initially hesitated to get involved, finally decided to speak openly about what happened to her son Jamal. She recounted how he had been brutally stopped, intimidated, and assaulted, and how she had fought in vain to find justice. As she spoke, her voice trembled, but she never hesitated. And in the end, she looked at Samuel and thanked him. "For years, I thought no one would ever care, that my son's story would be forgotten," said Marlene, with tears in her eyes. "But you showed up, and now, for the first time, I feel like someone is really listening. Thank you for not giving up." Marlene's words struck Samuel deeply. Throughout his career, he had faced difficult situations, but he had never felt the weight of responsibility like he did in that town. Knowing that his fight had given people the chance to be heard and, perhaps, to start healing their wounds, meant more to him than any professional victory. However, not everyone in town was happy with the changes. Some people still saw Samuel as an outsider who had come to stir up trouble, and there were times when he faced cold stares and hostile comments. But even that was a sign that things were changing. Those who benefited from the old system were losing ground and could no longer hide their privileges behind a facade of order. A month after Collins' arrest, a new community meeting was organized, this time with the presence of FBI representatives, state authorities, and community members. The meeting was a milestone, a formal acknowledgement that Oak Ridge was undergoing significant change. Samuel was invited to speak, and as he stepped onto the makeshift stage in the town's central square, he saw familiar faces in the crowd: Rose, Thomas, Marlene, and many others who had become part of this journey. He took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice calm and full of purpose. "I know that for many of you, the last few months have been difficult," said Samuel, looking at the people listening to him. "You have been confronted with a truth that many tried to hide for a long time. But I also know that, by facing this truth, you have shown a courage that few have. You have been heard, and now we are beginning to see the change we have long hoped for." Samuel paused, letting his words resonate before continuing. "The fight is not over. We still have a long road ahead, and I know there will be tough days. But I believe, more than ever, that we can transform Oak Ridge into a better town. A town where no one has to live in fear, where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. And this will only be possible because each one of you chose not to stay silent." When he finished speaking, there was a moment of silence, followed by applause that started out timid and soon turned into a wave of support. Samuel felt a deep emotion, a mix of relief, gratitude, and hope. He knew the work was not yet finished, but for that moment, he could feel that something real had changed. After the meeting, Samuel gathered with Rose and the others. They talked about the future, about how they could continue to support the transformation taking place in the town. As they spoke, he realized that the path to change was not a straight line but a series of advances and setbacks, victories and challenges. But what mattered was that, finally, there was hope. And that was something Collins, no matter how hard he tried, could never take away. The transformation in Oak Ridge didn't happen overnight, but the impact of Samuel's actions, along with everyone who joined him, was profound and lasting. With the arrest of Henry Collins and his allies, a new era began to take shape for the town, and the structures that had enabled the abuse of power started to be dismantled. The police department underwent a significant overhaul. External officers were brought in to conduct a complete audit, and those involved in abuses were suspended pending further investigations. A new leadership was chosen to guide the department, someone committed to transparency, integrity, and respect for the rights of all citizens. Laura and Samuel worked closely with local authorities to ensure that these changes were not just symbolic but structural and permanent. The days following the climax of the operation were filled with a rush of emotions for Samuel. He spent entire weeks handling testimonies, collecting additional evidence, and collaborating with the media to maintain transparency and ensure the public understood the depth of the problem. Yet, despite all the work, he still met with the community, making sure their voices continued to be heard. There was a personal commitment in everything he did, a promise that no one would be left behind. One afternoon, a few months after Colin's downfall, Samuel walked through the town center, which felt different. The faces that looked at him on the streets were now warm, and he saw smiles where there had once been distrust and fear. Thomas Bennett, the cafe owner who had been one of the first to support him, met him on the sidewalk and waved excitedly. "Samuel," Thomas called, running over to meet him. "I don't know if you've heard, but the town council is going to hold a ceremony in your honor this week. They want to thank you for everything you've done for the town." Samuel was surprised. He had never sought personal recognition. He just wanted to do what was right. But the idea of a ceremony, a moment to celebrate the changes, felt necessary, a way to symbolically mark the new era they were building together. "This is unexpected," Samuel said, smiling. "But if it means people are seeing the changes as something positive, then I guess it's worth it." On the night of the ceremony, Oak Ridge's central square was decorated with lights and banners that read "Justice and Hope." The event attracted a crowd much larger than Samuel had anticipated. There were entire families, children running around, and even some of the victims who had shared their stories, now with expressions of relief and gratitude. On the improvised stage, Samuel saw familiar faces, people who had become part of his journey: Laura, Thomas, Rose, Marlene, and many others who had joined him. When the town's mayor took to the stage and began to speak, Samuel felt a wave of emotions. The speech was brief but full of meaning. The mayor acknowledged the impact of Samuel's actions, the vital role he played in giving a voice to those who had been silenced, and his determination to ensure justice prevailed, even in the face of threats and adversity. "Samuel Reed, you have brought new hope to this town," said the mayor, looking at Samuel. "Your courage, integrity, and dedication have shown us that we can be better. On behalf of the entire Oak Ridge community, we thank you for what you have done, and we know that thanks to you, we are on the right path to building a more just and inclusive future." The crowd gave a standing ovation, and Samuel, moved, stepped onto the stage to receive a small symbolic trophy that represented gratitude and recognition. He held the trophy for a moment, feeling the weight of everything that had happened, and then approached the microphone. "I didn't do this alone," he began, his voice laden with emotion. "This victory belongs to all of you, to those who had the courage to speak out, to those who risked their lives and reputations to support this cause, and to those who continue to fight every day to ensure justice prevails." Samuel paused, scanning the crowd. True strength doesn't lie in one person or a symbol, but in the community, in the union of voices that refuse to be silenced. "You gave me the strength to keep going, and for that, I thank you." Samuel paused, letting his words resonate before continuing. "I know the road ahead will still be challenging. Change doesn't happen overnight, and we need to remain vigilant to ensure that what we've built here doesn't unravel. But I also know that together, we are capable of great things. And today, more than ever, I believe we can transform this town into a place where everyone feels safe, respected, and heard." When Samuel finished speaking, the square erupted in applause and cheers of support. He looked at Laura and the others, and they all smiled, sharing that moment of victory and relief. It was a night to celebrate, but also to reflect on the journey that had brought them there. After the ceremony, Samuel stayed in the square for a while, talking to people, listening to their stories, and sharing laughs and memories. He knew that moments like that were precious, that they were what made the whole fight, all the challenges, truly worthwhile. As the crowd began to disperse, Rose approached him, holding a small gift box. "I wanted to give you this," she said, with a warm smile. "It's something simple, but I think it will mean a lot to you." Samuel opened the box and found a small metal medal engraved with the words courage and truth. He felt his eyes fill with tears, moved by the gesture. "Thank you, Rose," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "It means more than you can imagine." She nodded, gently touching his arm. "You deserve it, Samuel, and I hope it always reminds you of what we achieved together." As Samuel walked through the square, the medal in his hand, he thought about the entire journey he had traveled since arriving in Oak Ridge. He thought about the sleepless nights, the threats, the confrontations, and the small victories that had accumulated into a greater victory. He knew that the fight against injustice was never-ending, but he also knew there was something profoundly beautiful about joining others to confront it, finding strength in the face of adversity. Looking up at the stars shining in the sky on that quiet night, Samuel felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. He didn't know what the future held, but for now, he knew that Oak Ridge had changed, and that was enough. Samuel Reed's journey in Oak Ridge serves as a powerful reminder of how the fight for justice is complex, full of obstacles, and often a lonely road. He confronted a deeply rooted system of corruption and abuse of power, risking his own safety to ensure the truth would be revealed. Yet, his story also shows that real change isn't achieved by just one person. It's the collective strength of a community that decides to stand together and refuse to accept injustice as the norm. The impact of Samuel's actions, along with the courage of the victims who chose to speak up and the support from those who joined him, was transformative. They proved that even when the system seems unbeatable, the truth still has the power to expose lies and corruption. But this victory also carries an important lesson. The fight for justice doesn't end with the fall of a figure of power. It's an ongoing battle that needs to be maintained, nurtured, and protected every day to ensure that the changes one are lasting. Think about Samuel's courage and the resilience of people like Marlene, who finally had the chance to be heard. How would you act if you were in their place? Would you be able to face fear and fight to expose the truth, even knowing you could face backlash? Or would you stand by Samuel's side, risking yourself to support a greater cause? What would you do if you discovered something profoundly wrong happening in your community? Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments. Your opinion matters, and your support for this cause can inspire others to make a difference. This story is an invitation for all of us to reflect on what it means to fight for justice, even in the face of adversity. If you believe that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and that the truth must prevail, share this story so that more people can see the power of courage and unity. Like, subscribe to the channel and leave your comment. How would you act if you were in Samuel's shoes? Let's keep this conversation alive because the fight for justice is ongoing, and it needs each of us to continue.